Hello, everybody. We're very excited to have you. We'll be waiting a few more minutes. As per the poster, we're starting at 1:15. But yeah, I wanted to welcome you already. And yeah, hope you can bear with us for another 5 minutes. The panelists are already all here, and we are all very excited.
All right, I think we can get started. So welcome to the public conversation series, South Designs, Planetary Futures. My name is Kenny Coopers. I'm a professor of architectural history and urban studies at the University of Basel. And together with my colleague, Laura Nkula-Vens from the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, co-organizer of this series. Before we introduce the speakers, Laura and I will just say a few words about the initiative and its framing. South Designs is part of a Swiss government-funded project called Governing Through Design, which supports critical and creative research on how design intervenes in everyday life world and planetary politics. And within this frame, we launched a call for projects to explore how design, when thought and practiced from the South, forges planetary futures. So our call asked what design responses to ecological crisis may look like when they are grounded in the aspirations and struggles of those most affected. And we were looking for projects that could show us how design grapples with radical ecological interdependence in conditions of enduring injustice and rapid urban and environmental change. And to answer these challenging questions, we realized we really need to start by reconfiguring our inherited ways of working. We both work in a global research economy that is massively unequal and that does not only reflect, but also helps reproduce social inequalities and epistemic injustice at a global scale. And one way to work against these structures was for us to change the concrete terms of labor and finance. So what we did was divert funds normally allocated to Swiss doctoral and postdoc research salaries to directly support ongoing activist and community-based work in under-resourced, marginalized or often marginalized contexts. Diverting funds in this way went hand in hand also with a redistribution of labor. Following donor-driven agendas, the Global South is often considered a site for the extraction of empirical data that are then theorized or valorized in the Global North. And with this initiative, we aim as much as possible within the constraints that we have to foreground Southern design as both practice and theory. And I'll hand over to my colleague Laura now to tell us a bit more about the process.
Thanks so much, Kenny. Wonderful to see so many people tuned in. So in terms of the process, we were really overwhelmed. We had over 150 teams from across the majority world respond to our call for projects. And thankfully, we were really lucky to have a brilliant scientific committee to guide us in our conceptual approach, our research ethical approach, and also practically in selecting the projects. And this multidisciplinary committee consisted of Gautam Ban, Wangui Kimari, Ana Maria Leon, Huda Tayeb, Hita Unikrishnan, and Michelle Weitzel. And as our critical friends in this process, we plan to engage them also throughout and especially in the final event of this series, which will happen next year. So the 6 teams that we were able to allocate funding to, award funding for, have been working for just over a year now on their respective projects. And in the following public events of this series, of which we will have 3 more this year, 1 in October and 2 in November, and then a whole roster again next year from February. They will show us their speculative proposals, their creative research, their experimental projects, and also some of their pragmatic design interventions. Then they will also explain how their practice is rooted in struggles for social and environmental justice, but also how their projects can serve to imagine and build planetary futures in and from the South. And in dialogue, or rather the project teams will be in dialogue with emerging thought and design leaders, and they will discuss how current social and ecological theory confronts the pragmatics and the urgencies, what it means to make things together and you know, across borders and difference, etc. Our opening roundtable today is setting the scene for these very propositional discussions. And we invited 3 prominent thinkers and doers to discuss the big questions that animate our initiative. And I will hand over to Kenny now to introduce them to you. And I also want to extend my thanks to them for making themselves available today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll keep these bios short so we have more time for discussion, but that should not say something, or that should say something about the prominence of these speakers whose bios you can find on the web. Jennifer Gebris is chair in Media, Culture and Environment in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge, where she leads the Planetary Practice Research Group. She's also a principal investigator of the ERC-funded project Smart Forests, Transforming Environments into Socio-Political Technologies. And today, Jennifer will draw from this groundbreaking research on activism and monitoring to outline planetary practices of citizenship. Paulo Tavares is an architect, author, and educator whose practice sits at the intersection of architecture, visual culture, and advocacy. And as many of you may know, together with Gabriela de Matos, he was recently awarded the Golden Lion for the best national participation at the Venice Biennale. Paulo will speak today about new ways of conceiving architecture in the context of his work with indigenous communities on land restoration in Brazil. And third, Michael Uemidimo is co-founder and director of CMAP, Collaborative Media Advocacy Platform in Port Harcourt, Nigeria. He is an award-winning filmmaker who some of you or many of you will likely know from the Academy Award-nominated BAFTA-winning documentary, The Act of Killing, which he produced in 2012. But in addition to filmmaking, Michael explores design processes through which violently marginalized communities in Port Harcourt in particular, can gain a greater measure of control over their representation and the shaping of their cities. So I'm very excited with this trio of prominent thinkers and practitioners to start a discussion. But to do that, we'll start with an initial response, an initial input statement of about 5 minutes, so that each of the speakers can give us a sense of the different positions and ideas that inform their practice. Then we'll get into the thick of things with our discussion, which I hope or will try to structure along some emerging themes before then opening up to questions from the audience in the last half an hour or so of our event. All right, and with that, I open the floor to Jennifer.
Oh, well, thanks very much, Laura and Kenny, for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to participate in this roundtable as a kind of structured conversation about South designs for planetary futures. This has been an immensely rich and thought-provoking opportunity to not only engage with your work on governing through design, but as well with Paulo and Michael on these topics, and to be involved in the opening event for this very compelling lecture series. And I hope everyone will have a look at the poster. There's many more talks to come on the projects that Laura has described. So in the description of this project and series, Laura and Kenny have provided us with 3 helpful questions to consider: how planetary futures are designed, grounded in, and responsive to conditions in the global South. And I want to take up one of these questions in particular, their second inquiry, about what design responses to ecological crises look like when they're grounded in the aspirations and struggles of those most affected, predominantly residing in the global South. And that's a quote from their question. I think this is a question as well as a challenge, to be grounded in the experiences of those most affected by ecological crisis. As much as a question as a demand, it suggests it is not sufficient to include merely a variety of perspectives about climate change from locations often marginalized or excluded from centers of power. Rather, by grounding responses to ecological crises within those communities most affected, a transformation and pluralization of eco-social responses and modes of organization must necessarily occur by reworking strategies and responses, infrastructures and investments, and ways of life that enable collective flourishing. So those most affected by eco-social crises are on the sharp edge of inequality. For many, climate change is not a future event with consequences for their children and grandchildren, as the narrative so often unfolds within more privileged circles. Instead, climate change is already forcing displacement due to flooding and desertification, leading to crop failures and food shortages, contributing to heat stress and death, and making already precarious living conditions even more impossible. Practices of day-to-day survival in these contexts rarely, if ever, count as design. This is in part because design has typically been the reserve of more privileged actors working for even more privileged clients. The somewhat controversial earlier exhibition and event designed for the other 90% out of the Cooper Hewitt Museum, which is 16 years old now, and was a text I once used when teaching design at Goldsmiths many years ago, makes this point about the tendency of most design to circulate within and serve spheres of relative privilege. And just as a footnote, this text was controversial because it was designed for rather than designed with, and could be seen to have a paternalistic and savior-flavored approach to social and environmental inequalities that potentially entrenches rather than transforms issues related to lack of food, clean water, and shelter. But design can also suggest a comparatively fixed set of conditions that would be planned for, built and rebuilt and improved in a kind of solutionist logic. And yet the luxury of forward planning and the ethos of modernist improvement can be less viable for those living in response mode. I then center this question about those who are most affected in the context of this conversation to sharpen and direct attention to the inequalities that differently run through Southern contexts, but also to make inequality a hinge for considering how Southern approaches force different ways of encountering planetary crises across multiple geographies, social political context, and entrenched conditions of power and resource shortages. Southern context can be marked by considerable inequalities, not just in relation to Northern contexts, but also across South-South relations and within national settings. Here's one way that the dichotomies of North-South, local-global, high-income, and low and middle income can potentially be recast through an active engagement with inequality and power, and by working toward the recalibration of these toward more equitable and ecologically responsible ways of life. In this sense, projects in Ghana and Chile, Indonesia and India do not settle into merely local conditions, since they unravel into a broader set of transnational connections and engagements with environmental destruction and inequality. So I'm sure we will discuss this in more detail as the conversation progresses. So I'd just like to close this short opening statement and provocation with reference to a concept and phrase, planetary praxis, I have worked to develop as a way to differently configure these questions of inequality, spatial durational practice, and social collective life. In a 2018 eFlux architecture essay, Becoming Planetary, I developed an approach to planetary praxis, or being planetary as praxis, by drawing on Gayatri Spivak and Sylvia Winter to rethink the globe and the human through the mutual, if pluralistic, imbrication of subjects and worlds. While the planetary is often a figure that propels discussions of urgency, scale, and a universal operating space, along with a universal singular human who would variously destroy or save the planet, I have sought to cultivate thought and practice that explores how the planetary undoes and remakes humans and non-humans as pluralistic figures and subjects. So by considering how the planetary is at once summoned and unsettled through ecological and socio-political crises, I seek to foster projects that rework environmentalist discourse and practice, and that propose different modes of environmental subjectification that are less accumulative, extractive, and more dedicated to mutual flourishing. So here I offer praxis alongside design as a way of working toward collective action and striving for equity, praxis is often most attentive to the power dynamics and inequalities that design can at times enact and obscure. Praxis also works to redistribute resources and build community infrastructures as a way to transform inequalities, as we heard with Kenny's opening discussion. And this is a through line in the Planetary Praxis Research Group as well. It is an ethos that informs the Citizen Sense project, which worked with communities to monitor air quality and to explore how to make more breathable worlds. It is also a focus within the Smart Forest project, which looks at how digital infrastructures can variously amplify environmental inequalities or provide generative ways of addressing and undoing these power dynamics. So alongside this important initiative on Southern designs, I would then add this contribution of being planetary as praxis, as a way to confront and transform the inequalities and injustices that have given rise to eco-social crises. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for a strong starting statement. And now I'd like to give the floor to Michael, if you would like to add the floor, the word.
Hi. So I just want to say a very few things from here, Port Harcourt. I think of Port Harcourt as a city of the future, and humanity's future is urban, and increasingly humanity's urban future is the future of African cities. And as you're every day very aware of in a city like Port Harcourt, informality or auto-construction is the dominant mode of African urbanism. And this mode fundamentally perturbs the notion of city-level planability. It disrupts our notions of grand design. And working with young people here, one senses every day that the future African city is both deeply informal or self-built and demographically and infrastructurally young. By 2050, being a young, disenfranchised slum dweller is going to be the core urban condition. And if large groups in our cities are denied security, a sense of urban belonging, a voice and a view in policy and planning processes, then these policies and plans will inevitably fail in ever more violent ways. Conversely, so the story goes, if overlooked communities can make themselves seen and heard, if they can give voice to their vision of a city in which they recognize and in which they recognize themselves, then they can change the city's plot. Change the plot in both the narrative sense and change the plot in the spatial sense. So design then is both storytelling and placemaking. And this is the story that our work here in Port Harcourt, the Human City Project, is predicated on. So we're trying to imagine what it might mean to realize a post-oil future in the oil capital of Nigeria. And we work in neighborhoods that are invariably described in the language of marginality, figured as peripheral, as on the edge, but whose residents are in fact shaping the face of the city and cities like this across the continent. So as we're gathered here today to talk about the Planetary, I'm very much rooted here in Port Harcourt, this city in the Creeks, in a very local context. We're a very small project, yet this swampy elbow of Africa has for 500 years been one corner of a Black Atlantic that was busy with a global trade of dark cargo. First human beings, then palm oil, coal, and now sweet crude and vast volumes of natural gas. And Port Harcourt was a city that was founded for the sole purpose of colonial extraction. The chronologies of modern colonialism, the establishment of West Africa's coastal colonial cities, and massive carbon extraction in the region are all closely intertwined. Colonialism, climate crisis have both been fueled not only by the same political, economic, and military forces of imperial domination, but also quite literally by the industrial combustion of hydrocarbons often extracted from little cities like Port Harcourt. It is, in a sense, violence by design. And in the later phases of European colonial scramble for Africa, this process was concurrent with a global expansion of oil exploration. Port Harcourt, in this regard, is in many ways the model West African coastal colonial city. It was surveyed to be the site for the railway terminus to bring coal from the fields in Enugu and the deep water port to ship that coal out along the colonial coast. And this city is named after the then Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Harcourt. And today one can see that the social violence of racialized segregation and the material violence of industrialized hydrocarbon extraction are inscribed into the master plans of the colonial city with its dense, squat native barracks and its leafy, expansive European quarter. And prospecting for oil in Nigeria happened against the backdrop of the British Admiralty's preparation to shift from coal to an oil-based fleet, a move that was finalized under Winston Churchill in 1912, which was the year that Port Harcourt was founded. So perhaps against this historical geographical sketch, we can consider some of our local improvisations in this planetary fame and how to think about Port Harcourt as a city of the future.
Thank you so much. And from this situated perspective of Port Harcourt, I think we can move to another one in Brazil and the Amazon to consider how we might understand and grasp the planetary politics of design from another angle, so to speak. Paulo? I think you're still muted.
Oh, can you hear me? Hello, everyone. So
Hi.
first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me well? Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Kenny. Thank you, Sepo Mokolo, who is also helping us on the backstage with the slides. It's a pleasure to be here with Jennifer and Michael to discuss this very big but important topics. Laura and Kenny asked us to provide a sort of 5-minute statement to discuss, you know, all those big questions that are posing this incredible project, the questions of South, the question of design, the questions of the planetary, and eventually the question of the future, which are, of course, a very, you know, big questions, big stakes that we need to discuss. And what I thought to do for this 5 minutes introduction is to throw on the table some of the conceptual, let's say, fields, or some of the concepts that through my grounded work, I've been trying to work with and speculate upon in order for us to sort of shift or reframe the ways in which we understand design and planning and architecture. Because for me, fundamentally, the ecological crisis and the potential of a sustainable planetary future pass through a type of, you know, decolonization or transformation of the concept of design, of planning and architecture. And Sepo, in fact, I had some phrases. These were my first slides. Do you have them? Up? No? There were 3 just outstanding phrases.
I think they might be coming now. Let me double check.
Oh, he's just saying no. Really? Do you think I might be able to share my screen maybe?
Yes, you will be able to share it. You can also just share them if you have it pulled up.
Yeah, I do have it. So They say I cannot share. So because that's not the right slide. So, you know.
1 second, I'll sort you out.
Thank you.
You should actually be able to share now.
Okay, so let's try this. Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so as I was saying, what I'd like to put on the table in this sort of first statement for our conversation are some conceptual questions that through my work, I have been trying to develop in as much as I think that the question of the ecological price and design passed through a sort of reconfiguration of the practice of design, or the way that we understand how design operates, and sort of challenging the sort of legacy from, you know, Western colonial modernity and how it has shaped the idea of design. So the first sort of conceptual statement is that the ecological crisis is not only a question of environmental repair, but foremost a question of historical reparation. Often, when we are dealing with the planetary crisis, when we are dealing with the questions of the Anthropocene, the fixes that are proposed are very much based on a technological fix that somehow abstracts history and the histories of colonial modernity and the violence of the implementation of racial capitalism in shaping the ecological crisis the way we experience today. And therefore, for me, to address these wrongs committed in the past, to address the question of reparation, and that means in terms of land, in terms of questions of housing, in terms of questions of infrastructure, and even questions of symbolic representation, is a topic that is essential for us to understand that we are going to, you know, heal the earth, right? So history should be entangled. We should understand the ecological crisis in relation to histories of violence, presence in colonialism, and reparation of the earth also implies reparation of communities. The second conceptual move that I'd like to do is the idea that we need to shift, and I'm being really speculative in the spirit, I guess, of the project, that we need to shift from planning to planting, right? The Anthropocene, and this is something that I've been thinking of, and somehow it bothers me, the thesis of the Anthropocene, it allows a certain type of reinforcement of the very sort of epistemological ground that, in my understanding, had led us to the ecological crisis at first place, which is this idea that man can plan and can design, you know, the earth as a whole. Right? So somehow the Anthropocene is saying, as much as we as humans or humanity have the power to shift the ecological balance of the planet, we have acquired the power to plan the planet as a whole. And I think we need to shift from this top-down sort of approach to something that's much more connected to a series of non-human agents that shape the environment together with humans. And of course, that planting is, by definition, a form of planning, but one that needs to be fine-tuned to the agency of numerous non-human agents that are part of the environment: climate, soil, animal, bees, insects. In that sense, one may think about how the concept of planting may lead us to a form of design that displaces the imperial power of anthropocentrism that has historically been embedded and has shaped design. And in a text that I wrote for Reflux, following Jennifer, it's called In the Forest Ruins, I propose that this design as planting is a form of design beyond the human, in the sense that it's a much more networked and shared process of understanding design that we conceived of in cooperation, in coordination with other species in all the sort of non-human communities with whom we live in the planet. And finally, the idea that if the city, if territory, if environment, if space, if land is a right, architecture design should be conceived and deployed in practice as a form of advocacy of those rights. What does change in the way that we conceive design if we don't stay in the sort of technical cultural realm, but we think design in relation to the city and space as a right. For me, that means that any possible planetary future or any possible way of addressing the ecological crisis should put the question of justice at the center of the problem, at the center of the question. A more resilient city, a more resilient neighborhoods, a more sustainable economy, a more sustainable technology is one in which the question of justice, the questions of reparation, the questions of equality are put at the center of the question, in as much as we won't have a chance to fix the ecological crisis if we do not address the patterns of exclusion, the patterns of inequality that we have inherited from the sort of colonial modern machinery of extraction and industrialization that has brought us here. So these are the first sort of three statements that I want to throw on the table. The idea that ecological repair is historical reparation, that we need to shift the ways we understand design for something much more attuned to ecological types of planting gardens rather than the kind of top-down way of planning that the Anthropocene is conceived, and that we should deploy design as a means of advocacy, because a more sustainable city is by definition a more just city. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These give us a lot of material, I think, to start thinking from and to start discussing from. So I'd like to have us perhaps start with the question of the South itself as a category. And of course, as your three statements already made clear, I think the South can be mobilized not just as a geographical location, also as an ontological position, an ethical or a political strategy, or even a state of mind. And I wonder how these different categories relate to each other, how you use them in conceptualizing your practice, and engage with the tensions and maybe even contradictions between these various positions and categories. For instance, centering the urban youth in African growing cities versus centering indigenous life worlds, what that does, so who the South is, where the South is, what the South is, and you know, what kind of relevance this question has for you, if any. Who would like to start? Maybe Paolo and Michael, if I can put you on the spot.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. It's a complicated question, of course, you know, because what does it mean to think that there is a design of the South, right? Or that South can be a sort of political position beyond, you know, the way in which the world is sort of structured geopolitically. Of course, that's, if we look historically, I think, you know, the idea of the global South, formerly known as, you know, the third world, formerly known as the colonized world, always had some sort of embodied a certain perspective of, you know, liberation struggles from colonial imperial powers, right? And I think that historically, especially during what is called the Great Acceleration after the Second World War, with the movements of liberation in the decolonial world, with, you know, revolutionary movements throughout Latin America, and, you know, nationalist governments that assumed after the liberation struggles, there was this idea that, you know, the South could have been as powerful as the North, in, you know, even in terms of large-scale strategies of planning and of design, and that these would drive a different way of, you know, shaping the South in the image of a developed modern civilization. And I guess in contemporaneity, we need to think about the South as something that is dissident from the way in which those things have been conceived of and thought of, right? So in that sense, a kind of epistemological political space that would allow us to think design in dissident ways instead of reproducing a certain type of toolbox or mentality that we have somehow inherited from very traditional ways that design is conceived. Don't know if that's sends you a message, Michael.
Yes, I mean, there's a reason why I didn't want to start, is because, you know, here we have a very kind of rice and peas, nuts and bolts approach to this. So, you know, most of our daily struggle, our daily enterprises of survival are about just trying to keep the wheels on the wagon, just trying to keep the project going. So when I'm faced with a question like, what does South mean to your project? I'm tempted to come back with what might seem like a cynically instrumental kind of response, you know, as opposed to a broadly discursive response. Like, what can the notion or the framing of the South do to get us the resources we need to continue our work? Because being in the South means that we are structurally disadvantaged. And so, you know, the question that we discuss every day with the young participants here is, how can you understand your own framing, the way that you are seen from the North? How can you use that image, use those tropes to mobilize resources? Not necessarily in a cynical way, but, you know, how to use that in grant proposals, how to use that in contexts that will make a difference to your everyday lives. The people we're working with are not in universities. You know, they're people whose day-to-day enterprises are building a city, right? I mean, they're actually building a city, but they're not concerned primarily with these discursive questions. So the South, what the South means here is what we can make it to mean in contexts like this.
Building on that, I think that's a really good point. Would you say that you know, this is another form of violence, as it forces people to understand their lives in vocabulary that is not necessarily you know, does justice to how they live or to their aspirations? And you talked about design as storytelling and making space. So how do you do that when those stories are then defined by an external you know, vocabulary?
Well, we have a mapping project called Chikoko Maps, and one of the things that we do at the beginning of our workshops is we turn the map upside down, right? And we look at some of the 1895 maps, you know, the Conference of Berlin maps, and we turn it upside down, and we talk about maps and map making as a process not simply of describing an independent, pre-existing objective reality, but a form of space making and of storytelling and an instrument of power. And that our map making programs, our mapping programs, can be a way of appropriating that power, of taking that power back, of turning order on its head, of putting the South on top. And so, yes, there is a sense in which, in a very practical way, when we're thinking about maps, when we're thinking about spatial orders, we do very immediately connect with the sense of which the South is an artifact of violence in a way.
Yeah, that might relate to Paulo's point about the need to be dissident to those colonial definitions that are the origin of why we speak about the South at all today. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to jump in, or Paulo respond to Michael's point.
I mean, just to quickly come in there, I think it's, it's interesting tracking current journalism on this topic, because within the space of security, finance, and politics, there's quite a lot of unease about the term the global South by major players in the global North, because there's this perception that somehow the global South, whatever this kind of grouping is not in support of certain geopolitical events having to do with Ukraine, Russia, and so on. So then there has been quite an extensive analysis of how, as Paulo was pointing out, the global South eventually did preempt third world countries and became this group of 77 plus China, but is in the kind of analysis of many of these commentators, less a geographic location and more a residue of economic inequality. So it's quite interesting to see how this term has to be sort of appropriated and recast in order to obtain the resources that have been denied to redress colonial dynamics, that this is a kind of artifice of sorts. But at the same time, it's something that's making major actors in the so-called global North also uneasy, so much so that, commentators in the Financial Times, for instance, have called for the end of this pernicious term, as they've referred to it. So, it's interesting how it has been seen to be an attractor of certain kinds of solidarity, of a multipolar world, of a redistribution of resources, but it's also something that is obviously a residue of violence and colonial processes and economic inequalities that also are having to be uneasily inhabited. So those dynamics are not easily resolvable, but certainly they are provoking different kinds of approaches to addressing eco-social crises, as your project shows. And then I think it's getting into the specificity of that, as Michael and Paulo show also with their work, of what does this look like to try to work with these imperfect conditions, but to undertake these transformations that might make more equitable worlds. And I think that's the interesting provocation that comes out of this, less that the Global South is an ideal branding project, but these are the kinds of histories that are in need of reparation, as Paulo's noted.
Paulo, you're
sorry. I always forget. Just to jump in, just try to connect what Jennifer and Michael are saying. I like very much how, in unfolding this discussion, South is not something fixed, right? It can also be, say, instrumentalized or used tactically in different ways. And I like what Michael said, to say, here South is also, it's precarity, right? We need to, it's about, difference in incomes, it's about a different way of getting by life, because the reality of the South is also very precarious for, many people. So it's also important how Michael also said, but for us, it's also a way for us to sort of mobilizing resources in the context of a project like this, because, there's a lot of interest in how, Northern institutions are going to address the South, are going to connect with the South, are going, to develop projects in the South. And I guess what Jennifer was saying, it's how this term is also mobilized geopolitically, right? And we have been seeing recently how, different foreign leaders, in that case, by chance, Lula from Brazil went to the United Nations and specifically asked for the northern countries that they need to pay the bill for the climate change. And there was a fund allocated to that, but that fund never left the paper, the project, and he stated, well, we need to do a sort of geopolitical reparation in that sense, and the United Nations is a forum for that, and things like this. And he's also pushing for the Security Council to have more countries from the Global South represented, and things like that. And I guess also for us here, specifically in Latin America, South has always also been a sort of, identity of certain types of political struggles, of, grassroots movements, popular movements, claiming South America as a sort of, political identitarian space against imperialism and things like that. So maybe there is a way in which, we do need to define what is the South, but how the South is also this very flexible in term that is mobilized, in different sort of registers. And maybe, an approach to it, if I understood Michael correctly, it's more like tactical, and understand that the term has a sort of different connotations when you employ, depending with whom you are talking with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Bill, Michael, unless you want to jump in,
just to say that the other thing that we're very conscious of here is this sense that the South is the future. And the South is the urban future. And so the concerns of the future of cities like Port Harcourt are planetary concerns, because if we imagine our urban futures with the kinds of imaginaries that we've received, with the northern imaginaries, it's an impossible future on a planetary level as well as on a local level. So we have to think of South as difference. We have to think of the South as an opportunity to imagine otherwise, to imagine a new way of being on a planetary level.
Absolutely. And I think building from what you just said also about the different rooms in which the South is mobilized, I wonder if you could speak a bit about your collaboration, who the we is that you speak about. I think solidarity is key to the kind of definitions of the South, but you mobilize it in different ways. So when you speak about we in rooms like these, it's not the same as the we that you speak when you are in your community, right? So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that and to collaboration in the different realities and different subjectivities that exist in your practice itself or in your community.
I mean, actually, I would hope that we does include people in this room. And, we often talk about here in Port Harcourt, in our meetings, in our groups, we often talk about the importance of not fetishizing the local, right? That we're here in a city that's part of the world, and we want to be involved in collaborations. We want to have visitors from Basel and Sao Paulo, and we want to be working on projects which matter to people here, but also which matter to people elsewhere. And so thinking about how to establish networks of solidarity across difference, because one of the troubles with a lot of development discourse is that it's very well intentioned and very determined to make a difference, but it can't deal with difference. It disavows difference, conflict, and contradiction. And so, we hope that the resources that we can share in spaces like this can matter here and there.
And maybe that's a great segue into the next big word in this in our title, which is the planetary. If you say speak about the we, as solidarity across difference, while also accounting for those different positions and life worlds that people inhabit. How do you move from that to thinking about the planetary? Maybe also in relationship to ecology and the more than human or other than human. But Paolo, maybe you want to jump in here, or Jennifer?
Yeah, the planetary, I guess this is more on Jennifer's courts, but just to pick up on something that Michael said and then pass the ball to Jennifer, I think, when you talk about the we and solidarity and working with people, I guess we also need to acknowledge that, this type of collaborative work, it's not some, fetishized idea of community and very pacified and, we're all a little community here local. For me, it's very much on this understanding that, how we, from the very privileged position of being designers, which as Jennifer mentioned very early on, it's a profession that's, or a discipline or a field that very much serves a certain type of privileged field, how we can acknowledge the violence, the power that architecture and design do, and how we can turn things upside down and mobilize it as a form of advocacy, but also when, collaborating with those communities, those activists, intellectuals, and things like that, how can we learn and sort of undermine the very structures of power that somehow, make design or has made design historically, right? So, and I guess this is the moment when we also include this room, when you can also, come back to the field of design and this very sort of spaces where you can discuss design conceptually and sort of, change the way that the disciplines operates. Yeah, and I guess, the question of the planetary somehow also enters here in a certain way, but I leave this for Jennifer and I come back later.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to pick up on that, I mean, I've been quite influenced by a text that, an essay that Spivak delivered in Switzerland in 97, I think it was, on the imperative to the planetary imperative. And she says that she really has a kind of project of the imperative of reimagining the subject as planetary. And this is in the context of migration, and sort of speaking to a Swiss audience to ask them to reconsider responsibility and really the right to responsibility. But I think this is something that I sort of worked over and through then also by picking up Sylvia Wynter's work on who or what counts as human, and her discussion of being human as a praxis. So the kind of intervention is then to bring these two thinkers together and to think about being planetary as a praxis, that we become particular kinds of subjects through planetary relations. The planetary is not a fixed backdrop or globe, but is instead a kind of unsettled figure. It's changing, it's forcing different kinds of transnational relationships and obligations that we might not have anticipated, for instance, with the example of migration. And this requires a kind of constant rethinking of the kind of subjects that we are, which I suppose then also informs my eventual investigation into citizenship. But I think this is the way in which the planetary isn't a static object that can be the site for design is usually conceived. And I think Paolo's spoken to that, and Michael as well. But instead, planetary is a kind of a force, an attractor and a reckoning that requires people to become different sorts of subjects through these relations, of course, which are about other kinds of humans and more than humans who are brought into different configurations. So I think what is potentially quite powerful about the Planetary is it requires that sort of open-endedness and responsiveness without a kind of absolute determination or fixedness that would be what I'll just refer to as the old kind of design, the 20th century sort of design, but really can start to be a trajectory toward working with these conditions of Southern urbanism, eco-social crisis, and potentially reparations, where the Planetary is also making demands in the way that we're having these constantly changing environmental conditions, resource shortages, and really requirement to cooperate in different ways and to think about building new infrastructures that are more equitable. So I see the Planetary as a way of grappling with that, if that's not too sort of abstract, but it really does place demands on, then I think about thinking about the designer as a different kind of entity. What are these potentially more collective ways of understanding, as we've been talking about through the project of collaboration, not as the kind of heroic, usually white male designer who would exert his plans potentially in service of even more wealthy actors, but rather is a kind of requirement to think through connection, connections that also remake us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for rooting this also in part in Switzerland. And I'm immediately thinking of, Hannes Meyer and modern housing projects, which actually were accompanied by a discourse of, earthly belonging, and of, relationships with ecology. But of course, we're also very much, about claiming space, and not about real connectivity or interrelationality. So that brings me back to Paulo's point previously of planting rather than planning, because obviously colonialism was also majorly about planting, right, and about plantations. So it's not that we have not been ecological or that there has not been ecological design. It's just been largely not of the type that we need. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to this idea of how you conceive of ecological relations and what design might bring, considering the dark history of ecological thinking and design.
Yeah, I want to jump on that because I want to say something about what Jennifer said, but since Kenny just put another question, I will try to respond to both. I absolutely agree that we had ecological design. The whole idea, I think historically, if you look to the great acceleration after Second World War, during the Cold War, these were very much ideas of ecological design on a planetary scale, including environmental warfare, right? Many large chunk of the Western ecological thinking comes from environmental warfare since the atomic bomb, right? And we can say the same thing about colonialism. It was an ecological endeavor, right? Including, ideas of climate change and ecological transformation were recognized by colonial administrators as they were trying to domesticate the earth. So this was already an ecological types of design. What we also need to acknowledge is that there's different types of ecological design that escaped and somehow resisted, those ways of conceiving the earth, because reparation is being done since, the wrongs have been committed. The resistance has always been there. And in as much as colonialism and imperialism is not only against people, it has been against the land, there is a way in which those types of struggles, they are always somehow completely interconnected, right? And the example that I always mention is Chico Mendes, the famous environmental activist defending the Amazon in the 80s when Brazil was under military dictatorship. So Chico Mendes was a union leader. He was a workers' leader, and he was fighting for freedom of speech, for the right to assembly, right, against an authoritarian terrorist state. But he was also fighting for the forest, right? So we cannot disentangle those things. This is a type of ecology in which, the freedom of people from power is also connected somehow to the questions of land and ecology and the protection of the forest. So this is a very significant example to me, because it shows that ecology is not only about environment, it's also about justice. It's about, who can organize politically, how they can organize politically in relation to the land. Now, just to, sorry to be so long, I just want to respond. What I really like about what Jennifer is saying is that, maybe the planetary is also a way of, we conceive a different type of political subjectivity, right? As political subjects, as agents of the political, and what does it imply in terms of practice if you think that your realm as a political subject, as a political agent, is the planetary? And I think that makes a lot of difference in terms of how we react on the world.
Thank you. Michael, I don't know if you want to respond to this, or Jennifer, back to you.
I'm happy for Michael to jump in.
Okay, I'm thinking of Amitav Ghosh's claim that there's an underlying violence, which is about rendering mute and brute, rendering as mere resource everything other than the human, including many humans, right? And that in some sense, we have to develop an ecological imagination which allows us to hear the voice and be responsive to the agencies of these other forces. And for me, this is just very difficult, because in some respects, like, I'm an unreconstructed child of the Enlightenment. I can understand how, yes, the volcano, we need to be sensitive to the signs of the signs and the forces that are moving around us. But the idea somehow that the volcano is speaking is difficult for me, right? And I want to hear the volcano speaking. I want to feel myself an agent amongst, this plenitude of other agents. But I find it very difficult, I must say, and I'm still somehow trapped in this old struggle, this old kind of heroic struggle, where somehow we can bulldoze our way forwards in a progressive manner. So yeah, I'm hoping that thinking about the planetary in this context will help me hear the volcano speak.
Can I say something to this? Disagree with Michael that we need to hear the volcano, maybe, coming from South America, and also to pick up on something that Jennifer said, the idea of a new political subjectivity or a new political subject, and maybe, this idea that nature starts to appear as a political subject, right? And what are the kinds of spaces that understanding that nature has a political agency or can have a political agency, what are the kinds of space that it opens up for us to act as designers? And I want to bring a very concrete example. When there was the explosion in the BP platform in the Gulf of Mexico, the only thing that BP did was how much money we need to give to the fishermen or to people that live from tourism that had their life completely destroyed. Right? So this was the means of reparation that they were doing for the sheer amount of oil that was dumped on the ocean. And that activists from different corners of the world, starting in Ecuador, decided to put a lawsuit and saying that on behalf of the sea, they were persecuting or charging BP for repairing not only the human communities, but they need to do a kind of planetary reparation, right? Because life on the planet has been affected on a geophysical level. And BP, besides, repairing the communities, should repair the planet, and it should repair the planet by leaving the same amount of oil that it has dumped in another oil field that it was supposed to extract. And this was a form of compensation, of reparation for the geophysical balance of the Earth. And I think this is a form of geoengineering design coming from the South, rather than, proposing, to put mirrors in the sun and avoiding sunlight to avoid global warming. You see, I think there's a question of justice happening there in that lawsuit that opens up a space for us to think a design that happens on the planetary level, because we're really dealing with the geophysical process of Earth, but something that's also thinking about, new political subjectivities. It's thinking about justice. It thinks about reparation. So maybe, there is a space for the volcano there, Michael.
I mean, I think that's a great sort of conversation across that example. And just to extend that a bit, I think what is really compelling about this example of planetary reparation and much more work in this area in relation to the rights of nature and bringing nature into constitutions is it's not just about making a voice for nature or hearing nature, and obviously very much in scare quotes and with caveats, all the usual caveats, but it's also about reconfiguring the cosmologies of understanding and experiencing more than humans, so that they're not having to speak in one authorized register, and so that forms of social organization are responsive and remade such that these other entities are able to show up, as it were, and not have to be converted into a singular register. And I think we're seeing many more examples, especially coming from different indigenous cosmologies, of the consequences of these modes of tuning in to different entities and how they can guide decisions. Some of my work that in a quite lateral way is working on air pollution sensing has also looked at how plants, mosses, and lichens can be sensing air pollution, for instance. And that isn't just about bringing vegetal operators into a kind of quantitative mode of measurement, but instead it's about understanding how these ecologies of sensing are indicating different things as bioindicators. They're indicating ecological relations. They're indicating a kind of accumulation over time, a kind of toxicity that's settled into environments as a result of industrial processes, and also then suggesting different modes of inhabitation and future practice. So I think with that tuning in, there's a kind of shift again in becoming planetary subjects that requires a thinking about modes of social organization and engagement.
Thank you so much. I wonder if we can bring this thinking to Michael, to your context in which material struggle is real, and perhaps there's a need for translation of these ideas, and this kind of attention to ecological interdependence in conditions where that is an absolute challenge, or can be seen as, or can be refuted as a luxury that there's no space for. What do you think about that?
What Paolo said about leaving it in the ground, leaving the oil in the ground is something that is a critical question for the Niger Delta, right? Because what oil has done here is created this violent rupture between the surface and the depths. The surface is the space of the shallows, the space of fishing, of farming, of everyday life, of boredom, of laughter, of inhabitation. It's the lived space. And the depths are described in these abstract terms, barrels. They are represented in these strange sounding seismography and directly plumbed into a global grid of energy flows and financial flows. And what that means is that people who are on the surface are in the way and they need to be bulldozed. And to change that, one has to say it's important to leave the oil in the ground, which in a country where the overwhelming majority of foreign currency comes from extraction, comes from selling oil, is a very difficult position, because for that position to work, there would have to be a global reconfiguration, right? There would have to be a different set of flows. There'd have to be flows from north to south for leaving it in the ground. And here then, this notion of reparations becomes a question of regeneration, of how to develop regenerative infrastructures in a place like Port Harcourt. How to address questions like energy democracy, the fact that people here use orders of magnitude less energy than people, I don't know there in New York, let's say. I'm sure there's great efficiency and frugality in Basel, but there's a massive kind of disparity in the amount of energy that's consumed, and somehow people need energy here, but we need to derive that from regenerative infrastructures. And to get those, we need to be able to imagine those futures. We need to be able to imagine what a future Port Harcourt could look like. And then we need to be able to transform or translate images into infrastructures. And we need to develop a new sensible relationship with our environment. And I'm totally fascinated with Jennifer's work and this process of sensing. We have a rice and peas homemade air quality monitoring program here, where we track the poison that we're breathing. And I'd love to see how that could grow into a process whereby people develop a new relationship with urban ecosystems, right? A new set of communications, a new set of understandings, a new way of informing urban space. So yes, it's just very hard to imagine that kind of space here. Like, in a way, we need these kinds of spaces. We need these kinds of moments to even be able to hold open and preserve a space where this kind of future could even be considered.
Can I say something to that? Sorry to interrupt, but this is a question that touches me a lot also, because, I lived in Ecuador for many years, and and the movement of leaving the oil on the ground very much sort of is related to that sort of ecological center of the world, which is Ecuador in many different ways in terms of ecological political movements. And likewise, the Niger Delta, it's also a country that has made its wealth from extraction, and Brazil as well. We have a big state oil company called Petrobras, and the government's now planning to extract oil from the delta of the Amazon River. And this is a big debate here. But whereas we see, for example, the North, and just to come back to this idea, the North-South, the North, we see how people are making movements to, defound museums that are founded on oil companies, like in England, BP and the British Museum. There is, other sort of extinction rebellion and calling for, these oil companies to leave the sort of realm of culture and things like that. In Brazil, we can absolutely not do that because the oil company literally pays the whole entire of Brazilian culture, including cinema, dance, theater, all the sort of cultural activities somehow come from the oil royalties or, the oil money that Petrobras, which is like this big sort of sponsor of culture. So, how can we, from the South, also think about those sort of contradictions, because it's not even a question for people to leave the oil on the ground in Brazil in a certain extent, right? Because we need to develop, we need energy, we need to take people out of poverty. So, how we manage those kinds of questions, in North and South, I think it's also a very kind of crucial question for us to be, very grounded and very sort of consequential and not, fetishize or or get grasped out of reality, because the reality is this one, when oil is still sort of a major player across many different fields in the South.
Yeah, very good. Maybe Jennifer, please.
I was just going to add a tiny little footnote to that, which is that the extractivism of energy, of course, is extending to more than oil now, with critical and green minerals in South America and also in other places. So there's always a kind of danger in the pursuit of a kind of different energy regime, that the extractivism continues and the material is the thing that's supplanted. So I like the challenge that Michael and Paulo are putting to rethink energy infrastructures, I think, as Michael said, in a regenerative way. How would that be done? How would that be done with a more equitable distribution, so that it's not just then loads of lithium that are coming out of the ground instead of oil?
Yeah, and in relation, sorry to interrupt again, I talk a lot, but I just want to pick up on Jennifer, because there was a moment in Jennifer that people from Ecuador, the kind of ecological movement, which emerged in the 80s, is a very feminist movement, and I had the privilege of being there. They say we need to stop talking about that the problem is oil, because the problem is really extraction. The model of planetary economy has been extraction as something that is unavoidable. And now they are really pushing the agenda, to say, what about if, extraction is something that we cannot engage anymore? So I think this question of energy and extraction is super important also for us to think about. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I don't want to interrupt any flow, but just to return to Michael's point about how can we start imagining this, I think this points us back to the question of design, which is arguably where we started from. Maybe this also as an invitation to speak from your practice, how you define or work with this notion of design, in taking into account also, of course, it's a very dark history, or it's the baggage that it carries. And that will be the last question, I think. Then maybe in 5 or so minutes, I'd like to open to the Q&A from the audience so they can chime in. Thanks. So design is imagination, I think, Michael, that was the prompt considered.
I mean, we have a number of production platforms. We have Chikoko Maps, Chikoko Cinema, have Chikoko Sounds, music production, Chikoko Solar. We're trying here to think about the production of imaginaries, of how we can root the production of urban futures in a process of reimagining, as I say, of changing the plot, both the narrative and the spatial sense. So in that regard, design is important to us. I mean, we have a bunch of musicians here who are thinking about branding. They're building a studio. They're trying to build an enterprise, a creative social enterprise, and they have to think about their sound, their look. We're thinking about public space and design in public space. Yeah, I mean, all the kind of obvious aspects of design are at play here. Thinking about how to take a greater measure of control over the shaping of the city, right? Yes, in that sense, it's a quite straightforward design practice.
Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to, or Paulo?
Paulo can go ahead.
Okay, Jim. Okay, very quickly, I think for me, and this is something that we discussed because we did the sort of prep for this meeting. Michael and Jennifer, we met in different occasions, and something that I was remembering our first conversation is that, and that for me is also very crucial, is that design, architecture, planning in history, it has always carried a certain telos, a certain sort of ethos, which is done for good, right? Which is, you do design, you deploy design to make things better, to make things more innovative in terms of innovation, in terms of, development, in terms of bringing civilization to people, in terms of, taking this enfranchised community and bring a bunch of designers from a state program or, USAID or IMF or something, and let's improve their lives, right? And there's this very arrogance in design making, which, try to flat down certain types of realities and certain types of knowledge as something that is backward or, that is traditional, that needs some form of improvement or technology that is going to be brought about design. But in fact, if you look in history, there is a way in which, design has in fact done very bad to many of those communities which it was supposed to help. Right. So one thing that for me to think design in contemporaneity that's crucial for me is first to abandon this idea that design is by essence something for good. Right. We need to let it go ideas of, help, ideas of, making it better, of developing. Not that design does not do those kinds of things, but not necessarily it does these kinds of things. So something that I like to say is that, what I call reparation architecture, I say reparation architecture does not offer solutions to social problems, because this is a kind of idea embedded in the kind of principle design. It draws alliances with social struggles. How we can think that design is not offering a solution, but it's in fact sort of contributing in a process that is related to social and spatial justice. So I think that for me, this is, this try to think about this in this way is something sort of crucial to understand, design in contemporaneity. And I don't know what Jennifer think about that, or, in your own practice on design.
Yes, absolutely. I think this did come up in our pre-meeting, this kind of critique of design thinking, not just how it has been historically aligned with development projects, probably before it was called design thinking, but how now it's also deployed for any number of projects that are remaking organizations through a kind of aesthetic package of maneuvers that potentially do abstract away the kind of politics and inequalities of certain situations. And I've seen quite compelling sort of presentations and discussions on this, for instance, in places like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and other situations where design can come in and really sort of gloss over the inequalities that are being extended in certain locations. So I think this is definitely something that is running through not just the histories of design, but its current form. And I think once again, we've sort of heard about how design can be a tactic and a way of mobilizing different platforms with Michael's work, but it can also raise many different concerns. I think this is why in my own work, I've had a kind of uneasy dance with the term design, having been trained in landscape architecture, practice in that field, then teaching design for a number of years. And through all of that, I started to use the term creative practice and then practice-based research to talk about ways of undertaking collective inquiry for mobilization that wouldn't necessarily present a neat and tidy package of a kind of saleable object at the end of it. And I think this is the space that I've now settled into, now using the term also praxis, to attend much more to sort of inequalities as well as possibilities for collective organizing, to think about practice beyond a kind of potentially individual actor or a set of maneuvers, and instead toward forms of social organization. So I think I'm engaging with design, but always trying to qualify, disrupt, and transform it with different parallel terms and modes of encounter that don't allow design to settle into business as usual. And, you know, I thought it was interesting that Paulo also used this common phrase of design for good, because, of course, many of the designers I've met who are in industrial product design are often extremely disenchanted with their profession because they're working in something like tech. And they say that their work primarily consists of making objects more obsolete. So they'll be working on things like the iPhone. And they develop this fatigue and exhaustion with design's imperative to make the latest gadget to serve consumer capitalism. So I think within the fields of design, there is a kind of real reckoning that has been taking place about the kind of planetary destruction also that is just kind of the baseline for many design practices.
Just in response to that, Jennifer, I think about abiding design. And, you know, the position of the designer is critical. I mean, in a lot of these discussions, there's often the assumption that the designer is coming from elsewhere, has a kind of parachute consultancy relationship with the site. But in our design practice, what is critical is abiding design, is the fact that the designers live here, that they're not apart from the place, they're a part of the place. And yeah, I think this is also this also reveals that there's the understanding or the kind of received notion that the designer will be from elsewhere, always will be from the north. The designer will have expert knowledge that was produced elsewhere. And that, again, what we're trying to do here is to shift the geographies of knowledge production, and to say that, you know, in the space of abiding design, what we're seeing, as in this project, right, is about redistributing design resources and capacities so that you can have a space of abiding design, and you're not building in obsolescence. You're looking for how to develop regenerative infrastructures in that sense.
I think that's a very useful way to think about one's own practice. And I wonder if maybe Jennifer and Paolo, you can speak to that as well, to how your own work impacts, I mean, is shaped by, but also tries to nudge some of these, you know, geographies, unequal geographies of knowledge production and design practice. And I'm thinking of, you know, the many rooms in which and spaces in which you move as academics, activists, practitioners across North and South, as we are now, as well, and how you perhaps divert resources, remake infrastructures in order to make visible the communities of concern and that you work with.
I mean, I'll just jump in with a very quick example from the Smart Forest project, where we're working in a number of locations through different case studies, including Indonesia, India, and Chile. And with these, I think that the kind of redistribution of resources, the building of infrastructure, is not something that we can necessarily decide in advance. What resources might be required, what infrastructure might be regenerative, in Michael's words, really is something that needs to be developed through collaborative inquiry. So, I mean, with a project I'm working on with partners in Chile right now, we're looking at how wildfires are addressed across different actors from the perspective of a forest reserve, and how to take into account the different digital technologies that are used and who is building those and what sort of logics are coded into them and who has the resources to deploy them, and whether and how that is a kind of productive way for local communities to also think through issues of landscapes that are increasingly burning and heat-stressed environments. So I think that what is the really sort of salient factor of these approaches to infrastructure is that they're in the making. They really have to be built along with communities. The extent to which they will become regenerative is always kind of open-ended question. And this is something that came up in the Citizen Sense project, is building these air quality monitoring infrastructures. It takes so much work, attention, care, and involvement to really keep a monitoring network ticking over and to create pedagogic tools and ways of mobilizing data and to coordinate with different stakeholders and communities to make that data circulate in ways that it can have effect. So I think this is where the kind of longevity of projects also becomes a real kind of question and concern. To what extent can these become self-generating, self-perpetuating, and what kinds of resource distributions would be needed to ensure that? I think that's where Lula's point comes back to the fore. I mean, this really is not about pilot projects. This is about remaking worlds and the kinds of investments that are needed to realize that.
Paolo, unless you want to speak to that question, I'd like to open up to some of the...
Yeah, just please open up. I think I feel contemplated by Michael and Jennifer's reply on that.
All right, great. And you can always jump in to answer that later. I think I'll start with what was the first question, Ray, Levi's question about the planetary versus the global. I don't see it here. Yeah, he phrased it in a more elegant way, or she, than I'm doing now. But in what way does a subject that is framed through the planetary differ from the global, and this particularly in relationship to I guess, capitalist globalization? Are we re-entrenching ideas of that? And how does the planetary differ? And I think that's a question for Jennifer.
I mean, inevitably, I'll just reference here Spivak's point, which is, it's impossible, I think, to surpass, is the globe is on our computers, no one lives there, was what she said in this original address. And I think that perfectly sort of captures the abstractions of the globe that she was trying to sort of work against in the configuration of the planetary as an inexhaustible diversity of epistemes, I think was her phrase. And, I think that's a very productive ground from which to then think through the global as potentially quite a kind of hermetically sealed object on which grand projects are apparently undertaken, and how that has to be unsettled to account for the pluralistic range of experiences and inequalities that we've been talking about today, which the Planetary knits through in a much more sort of variegated and differential way. So I would say that's the imperative of the Planetary, and also what it very much offers as a kind of ground for transformation and further projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the question by person KM in the similar vein is probably also answered by this. Isn't Planetary and the idea of knowing the world in totality a deeply colonial trait? I think, yes, we'll refer back to Spivak in order to differentiate between this kind of bird's eye view from nowhere of the globe and the Planetary as always situated and always relational. All right, the other question, Clemens' question, of design vis-a-vis craft. I don't know if everybody sees that. I'm curious to hear more about your takes on the complexity surrounding design as a fraught concept, as especially vis-a-vis indigenous craft and how that might be reconciled. Paolo, that sounds like a question you'd be most appropriate to answer to, but don't feel obliged. Everybody
No,
can.
in fact, when I have to say, I mean, although, I'm called here, maybe my work is known because I had the privilege to work with indigenous folks, intellectuals, activists, designers and communities. I don't put myself in a position of being an ethnographer or an anthropologist, to know about, questions of indigenous crafts and things like that. So I'm certainly not the right person to answer that question. And I guess, one would need to address those folks who are working on that field and with design to think about how different indigenous designers are sort of thinking about that. And I guess there's plenty of information out there to look for it. And it's certainly that if I can bring an example taught from a friend of mine, Ailton Krenak, who is a designer, by the way, and one of the most prominent intellectuals in Brazil, I guess. Once he was in a museum and he saw an instrument that should never be exposed in a museum because it had many sort of spiritual and sacred dimensions to it and a certain level of secrecy to that. And, he questioned that this would be exhibited as an object of design, right? So I guess, design also comes with many of these problematic political contradictions, which are part of the very history of how design has been thought and displayed and curated and so on.
Thank you. Next question by Ozan Güngör. A question from Michael. Instrumentalizing Southern identity to mobilize resources, is that not detrimental to Southern identity itself or to perhaps Southern aspirations or projects? And the rest of the question, I think, I'll leave to you.
I mean, if these grant proposals were being read by lots of people and they became, they had an impact outside of a very narrow circle of consideration, then maybe. But in the meantime, we have to keep the wheels on the wagon. I mean, yes, in a sense, it's doing violence to oneself. But it's also, I think, determining just deciding to make do, right? I mean, we're in a space of really scarce resources with grand designs, grand ambitions, and somehow we have to make do. Ideally, we would respond in a totally new language and the reviewers would read our response and the scales would fall from their eyes. And they would say, oh, not only are we going to receive this language as radical content, we're also going to allow this language to restructure us institutionally. But in the meantime, you know, it really is a struggle, and one has to use what one has to hand. And sometimes that's this trope, this figure.
Can I sort of quick follow up on that? I think the question is who instrumentalized? When it has been instrumentalized, because, you know, it's also a way in which the North has instrumentalized the South in many variables that the term has, also in order to, you know, address things of the past, right? Address colonialism, you know, coming to terms with their own guilty, you know, comes to terms with the way in which, you know, it exerted violence and the way in which that place of privilege comes from this. So, you know, a project like this, well, South Designs, you know, maybe it is an instrumentalization of the South in a certain way, right? I remember when I was in Basel, there was this studio at the School of Architecture in Basel, and they just went to study cities on the South. You know, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, because that was the, you know, the urban problem was. And I remember I proposed, you know, maybe we should, you know, make a studio in Africa and study, you know, Europe and why Europe doesn't have a sort of, you know, what is the border, the fortress Europe, and make a, you know, a perspective on migration for those who migrate. Right. So there is an instrumentalization of the South, which is, you know, that's why I say it's tactical, because it is already there. And, you know, and how one being instrumentalized as this, you know, if you come from the South, you're always, you know, invited to teach in a school because they know that with you there, they will get access to territories that they would not have. Because you know the stuff on the ground, you know the people on the ground, you know how to enter those spaces, right? So how ones navigate, you know, all these spaces between North and South, you know, and even here, for example, sorry to extend myself, but I am a teacher of a university. If I'm going to work with a community, you know, they would see me also in a different light and how one constructs certain things around a common goal. So, you know, it's very complex how, you know, one navigates that space. I don't think it's, you know, black and white. I think it's, that sense, much more tactical, much more contextual, you know, how one navigates the sort of complex cultural architectural field and how it operates globally.
Yeah.
Thank
There's
you.
a certain element of cultural arbitrage, right? I think often at play.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think, you know, just to be clear, we have nothing to do with that School of Architecture. Though, of course, the question, I think, about who speaks and who instrumentalizes is key. And I think, as you say, Paolo, breaking apart the, you know, the South as not this monolithic block, but also when you're there acknowledging you know, the stark differences and movements across, right? Solidarity across differences is not just happening from, you know, a northern southern position, but also in much more complex geographies and distances that are not just geographic, but also epistemic and material, etc. I think we're about to end, but suddenly the interesting questions appear in the chat. Next time, I hope they come just a little earlier. For us to engage them. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I would invite everybody to read these and feel free to respond to them, add your email. I hope maybe there's some technical possibility to do that so that we can address them and maybe in some of the next events. So yeah, I'd like to then close, if that's okay with everybody, and thank Tsepo Mokolo, who's been managing this whole thing behind the scenes. and of course my colleague Laura Nkula-Vence, as well as the scientific committee, Gautam Ban, Wangoi Kimari, Anna Maria Leon, Huda Tayop, Hita Ushnikrian, and Michelle Weitzel, and of course the 6 teams that will follow to showcase their ongoing work in the series. The next event is taking place in a few weeks, Tuesday, 24th of October, same time, where we'll discuss occupations as forms of design in response to systemic injustice. Framing occupations as adaptive reuse of underutilized spaces unsettles dominant approaches to environmental sustainability and so-called green transitions. That's the starting point for that discussion. And we'll have the Planetary Occupations project team discuss their work with occupants of Sissi Gul House, which is a social housing occupation taking place in Cape Town. And we'll hear more about the design vision from below and the counter plan for the site's future. And this team will be in dialogue with architect and educator Nanaya Biama Osofu, and they will outline an approach to ecological design unchained from logics of property and accumulation. More about this event on our website. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned.
And thank you, Paolo, Michael, and Jennifer. It was an absolute pleasure. Please, you're welcome to rewatch this and also share this lecture on YouTube. You know, the YouTube live will be up shortly, and yeah, we hope to see you soon. And yeah, you'll be tuning in a month's time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No.
It was wonderful. Thank you for the time.